This is a theme you find in building codes and standards, which is the United States does not interact with the rest of the world in a deep way. They don't consider, are we making it harder to build a new building at all? This is really the challenge of anyone who wants to build multifamily housing and wants to, change these codes to make it easier to build denser forms of housing in denser places.
Welcome to the Building Culture Podcast, where we explore holistic solutions to crafting a more beautiful, resilient, and thriving world through the built environment. I'm your host, Austin Tennell. If you are in the market for high quality windows or doors, whether residential or commercial, new construction or remodels, I highly recommend you check out Sierra Pacific Windows, who we use at Building Culture on a lot of our projects, as well as if you are in the state of Oklahoma, check out One Source Windows and Doors, and want to thank them for sponsoring this podcast. Stephen, it's really nice to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So you lead the Center for Building. Can you give everyone a little bit of background of what that is and who you are?
Yeah. So the Center for Building in North America we're a 501c3 nonprofit that I founded about 2.5 years ago with the goal of doing research and some advocacy about building codes and sort of related technical construction policy in the US and Canada. And I got into it. My earlier career was spent, I was a reporter for a while. I wrote about, among other things, land use and zoning. And then I worked in real estate and dealt with those a little bit. And, there's been a lot of talk about zoning. The YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard, has really, made that a hot topic of discussion, states and cities, but also nationally. And they've, especially on the West Coast, have, really won a lot of victories in changing zoning codes. But something that I was hearing and seeing was that even if you change the zoning code, there are other barriers to, especially urban infill, multifamily, townhouses, sort of denser forms of development in already developed areas. And an area that I was just hearing a lot about was building codes. And then when I tried to learn more about it, found little to nothing that was sort of relevant to what I was hearing about. And so I figured, be the change you want to, see in the world. So I founded this organization, and the goal is to, study building codes, which can be quite dense and technical and, mostly not very interesting. But a lot of it is very interesting, and I think speaks a lot to why why this country has such a hard time building cities.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into the first question I want to ask you, really, which is like, why would anyone listening care about this episode, care about this issue? And it's kind of like, building codes, I'm not a builder or something like that. And, just to kind of kick off a little bit, a thought is there is a lot of regulation in this country. And most reasonable people would say, we need regulation, right? We need good regulation to protect people and keep things moving in a positive direction. But at some point, that regulation can become, and almost always does become over enough time, counterproductive, because you've got regulation layered on top of regulation, layered on top of, this regulation is trying to solve this other problem, creates a new problem. And then, before you know, and it just builds, it never goes away. It never gets smaller. The code book, every 3 years, it gets updated. And it's not like they take out previous sections or remove things. It's just additive. And at this point, I think when we talked last, you were talking about like, you could spend your entire life in kind of like one section of the building code book, whether it's fire codes or mechanical, because it's just so massive and dense that no one can even wrap their heads around. And I think, and why I really enjoyed our first conversation, was hearing someone else articulate how it's gotten kind of so destructive, how these codes actually are formed, and what to do about it too. Not just like a hopeless take of, hey, okay, here's what's next. Now it's going to be a long fight, all that. But so that kind of prefaces it a little bit, but in your words, why should people care about this?
Yeah. So, I think an architect, as they work in their more cynical moments, they might say, the architect is not designing the building, the codes are designing the building. And there's, some truth to that. we the built environment is highly regulated for good reasons. It's not like culture or technology, software where it doesn't really have a big impact outside of the exact doesn't have a it's not like a field that doesn't have a tangible impact on health and safety. For example, there's massive health and safety issues around the built environment, as we see in as we're recording. I think there's still fires burning in within the city of Los Angeles. um not but so you know it's we've gone too far to like totally deregulate the thing, ever since, massive urban fires in ancient Rome, 2000 years ago. It's been obvious that governments will regulate the built environment. And so the question is how? And I think people in the United States often sort of assume that there's maybe not there's one way of doing things, but there's sort of a narrow range of possibilities, and that's that. But the truth is that the United States and Canada in particular have a very unique way of building. And any European could tell you, we build out of, brick, stone, and concrete, and you build out of wood, but it goes deeper than that. And the American way of building, I think, has been, I think, pretty well suited to, single family houses on large lots, with a lot of separation between between each building, and, in a very suburban environment. And, that's how this country, for a long time has grown. And, we've developed a lot of innovations in building technology to make that easier, whether it's light wood frame construction, balloon frame, and later platform construction, and, which I guess was invented in Chicago in the early to mid 1800s, to, today, we have all sorts of very special things in our buildings that you don't find abroad. But I think it's important to remember that this is a unique way of building, and it's not the only way. And if so my organization, there's a million ways to approach the question of how do we build, how should we build, what are the ways, and you can spend all day coming up with possibilities. But I think it's at least to start more fruitful to just look at the different ways that people actually do build. And to that end, the Western Europe and sort of more broadly the rest of the world have one way of building, and North America has another. If you put it in two very large buckets. And I think not often enough in the United States do we think more about how they build abroad, and how it, if you go to Europe or Asia, and, you walk through the cities and you say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have that here? Well, you have to follow their rules if you want their outcomes. And I think, everyone recognizes that with zoning, that you're never going to get, a beautiful Tuscan village with, quarter acre minimum lot sizes and two parking spaces per apartment. But I think it's also true of the building codes and these more technical standards that govern, the nitty gritty of construction. So, a lot of it is very dense, and, most of it, frankly, is not that important, or rather, I shouldn't say not that important, but they're not, meaningful differences between the United States and other places. But where there are, they can really have a huge impact. And, why you should care is that in an actual development project, especially a denser development project, the land is a minority of the costs. And, the YIMBY movement and urbanists and housing reformers have focused a lot on zoning, and rightly so, it's very important. But, that affects the price of the land. But, if the price of the land is 20% of your total development cost, that leaves a lot that you can't touch by changing zoning. And, most of the cost of construction is the parts and the labor of the actual bricks and mortar in the United States, the wood framing and the gypsum board. So, to affect the price of that aspect of it, you need to actually look into the rules that govern the game. And some of those might be as far afield from construction as immigration policy, for example. Construction in the United States and everywhere has a lot of immigrants in it, so your immigration policy will definitely affect the type and the cost of housing you can build. But there's also the technical nuts and bolts stuff, the building codes, the standards that govern it. And I think that is something that deserves more attention, both from people in the field, but also from outside of it. I think it's helpful for the the building codes and standards world to realize that what they're doing, other people might have an opinion who have not traditionally been heard. And that's what we saw in the Indian movement is, people from outside the land use world, having an opinion. And I think it'd be great for that to come to building codes as well, and maybe like the next frontier after zoning.
Absolutely. I mean, the industries respond to incentives, and in my opinion, as kind of a builder developer and run a design build develop company, I'm not an expert in these things, but like I've seen enough to see, okay, where not only zoning is one thing that kind of prioritizes, it incentivizes super low density suburban sprawl and then super high density high rises. The building codes actually do too. It's actually pretty easy to build single family detached houses on big lots. And it's actually kind of easy in some ways. I don't mean it's easy to build a skyscraper or a big multifamily building, but the codes kind of work in favor of those. The hardest thing to build is that missing middle housing of townhouses, row houses, smaller apartment buildings, because of some of these odd regulations around fire or elevators, for example, that we're going to get into. And so maybe a good place to start, because I think it's such a uh, clear one, is with, for example, elevators. And I'll just kind of give one example of how we've struggled with this and been highly irritated in our own building, which is actually making things less accessible because of how draconian uh, our elevator rules are in the US. So we're building Townsend, this townhouse neighborhood, and there's rules around, I'm going to get some of this wrong, but there's FHA rules around if you have more than four or more townhouses attached to each other, somehow certain regulations get put in place, and then suddenly everything has to be accessible. I don't think it's elevator yet, but the weird thing is if you've got three townhomes and you put an elevator in one of them, you're fine. You can just put an elevator and do nothing else. If you have four townhomes attached to each other, that triggers something where suddenly that one townhouse, you're putting an elevator and you have to make the entire townhouse accessible because there's four or more townhouses together. And just from a so people understand the consequence of that, making a townhouse accessible, especially if you're building smaller footprints, 1,500 square foot townhouses, 2,000 square foot townhouses, the elevator already takes up a lot of room. But then if you're having to make room for a wheelchair in the bathrooms and all kinds of stuff, it completely destroys the floor plan. I am not saying we should not have accessible units, but to make this random arbitrary rule that, okay, three townhouses is fine. Once you hit four, it creates all these different rules. And then guess what? It makes us be like, well, fine, we're not going to put an elevator in anything. And on top of that, the actual elevators, and granted, I mean, in residential, we've got some residential elevators, which is an interesting, nuance that you helped me understand. Of in other countries, there's not even really such a thing as commercial versus residential elevators sometimes, because of how our commercial elevators are just so insanely large and expensive that it makes it very hard to make a lot of commercial buildings work. So I'm going to kind of toss that over to you, because that's actually how I got in touch with you. I was complaining on X about some of these rules and elevators, and then stumbled across you again. I had quite a while ago, and just anyway, it made me reach out.
Yeah. So my organization's first research report was about elevators. I was speaking to an Italian architect. Well, I'll tell you how it started. Actually, it all started on, I guess, what at the time was Twitter. There was an architect, a developer in Minneapolis. He posted a picture of a 3-story walk-up that he built.
Sean Sweeney.
Sean Sweeney, yes, yes, yes. He posted a picture of a 3-story walk-up that he built, and he was, he's talking about how it was relatively affordable, and by the standards of coastal housing prices, the rent was very affordable. And he said, 3-story, single stair, no elevator, just sort of showing how you built lower cost housing. And there was just, it escaped the world of real estate Twitter. And, all these people were commenting, oh, there's no elevator. You must hate disabled people, a bunch of curse words, blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, like, I've got my own health problems, and I would really like an elevator in my own building, which is a lot taller than 3 stories and doesn't have one. But I was thinking, like, have these people ever been in an apartment building before? 3-story buildings don't have elevators in America. And then I thought, 3-story buildings do have elevators in Western Europe. And America's much wealthier than pretty much every country in Western Europe. Why do we not have elevators? And I asked an Italian architect, I know that in the United States, for a 3-story building in a low cost market like Minneapolis, an elevator, just the elevator, let's ignore the shaft and the, whatever else, but just what you're paying Schindler, Otis, Kone to install the elevator in the shaft is it'll be north of about $100,000, probably between the 100, 150 for 3 stories. And I asked an Italian architect, and he was like, "Oh, that'd be about 20 or 30,000 euros in Italy." Um, and he was right. That is the difference. So our elevators are substantially more expensive. So trying to understand why, and it got me to write this report. Is about 122 pages long, and it gets into a lot of different things. And there's a lot of themes in it that I've noticed, and you can see in other parts of the construction industry. Actually, let's take them. I'll take three of them. So they're going to be a lack of harmonization of codes and standards is one, over dimensioning is another, and then labor is the third. So for the lack of harmonization of codes and standards, when you build, there's a building code, and this governs relatively general things about the building: how wide the hallway needs to be, whether you need to build the building out of concrete and steel or wood, how many stairs you need, etc. But then there's this whole web of what are called reference standards. So every part of the building, whether it's a smoke detector or a self closer on a door or an elevator, has to then meet another set of rules. And this is like this everywhere in the world. That's never going to change. People really want their things to work. There are these sort of subsets of rules that are called standards, reference standards. They're referenced by the building code, they're standards. And there is a general movement to harmonize these globally so that every country has the same standard. So, even if different countries say, the elevator has to be this size, or it has to be, installed in this case or not that case, that once you do install the elevator, at least you can buy the same elevator everywhere in the world. From, Malaysia to Germany, you can buy the same elevator. And so the rest of the world has sort of settled on what are really European elevator rules, because that's traditionally been the center of the elevator industry. So a small country, a large country, China or Switzerland, you can pretty much sell the same elevator in these countries. And it creates a really competitive market. I know that trade is not always the most politically popular thing now, but it really does do a good job at lowering prices. One of the reasons it's maybe not so popular. You can move production to lower wage places. You can really spend a lot of time optimizing your devices, doing a lot of R&D to drive down the cost of this or that, make it just a little more efficient to install this or that. And you get these real benefits of scale. And we see this in the elevator industry. It's a really finely tuned device. And the United States sits outside of all of that. The United States and Canada are two of the only countries in the world that decided we're not going to adopt these rules. We're going to have our own. And this is a theme you find in building codes and standards, which is the United States does not interact with the rest of the world in a deep way. They do not trust things that come out of the rest of the world. And in a lot of ways, we can afford it because we're such a wealthy society, although at times we run up against the limits of this because we still have resource constraints. So in the elevator industry, for example, we have, when you build an elevator, the really technical details, let's not even the size of the elevator, but things like how long the tow guard needs to be, or what kind of communication device you need inside of it, or where the machine sits, is governed by a set of standards written by the American Society for Mechanical Engineers. It's called the A17.1 standard. And the whole rest of the world essentially follows these European standards. So there's really two major markets in the world for elevators. One is the United States and one is the rest of the world. And the United States has many fewer elevators than the rest of the world. So when you make a part, some little $2,500 part, whatever, that goes into an elevator, you're not likely to spend the money first to get it approved for the US market. You're going to get it approved for the global market first, because it's going to open up a much larger market for you, much more larger, more competitive market. And so the United States sort of gets left with, a less competitive market. New technologies don't come to the elevator industry as quickly in the US as they do in Europe or China. So that's one thing. And you find this all throughout building codes and standards. So I was speaking with an architect who was working with a development group in New York City, and they wanted to make affordable housing. And they were doing panelized construction, where you you build the walls and the floors off site, and then you assemble them with a crane. So it's not full modular construction where you've got a whole room sitting on a flatbed truck, but you had the two-dimensional parts, the floors and the walls essentially. And they were they were putting them all together somewhere in Europe, somewhere actually outside of the European Union, but in a place that's still generally governed by European Union codes and standards. And they were having a really hard time sourcing, I think it was gypsum board that complied with the US standard for gypsum board. And it wasn't because we have stricter standards or even different really standards. It was because it costs a lot of money to get a part certified that it meets the standard. And the truth is, gypsum board is the same in Europe as is in the United States. But if you have to jump through a whole different set of hoops to sell it in the United States, you're located in Europe, all of your clients are in Europe. And then, if you're selling slightly outside of Europe, they'll probably accept European standards because I think generally everyone in the world recognizes that Europe has some of the best construction standards. You're not going to spend the, $500,000 or whatever it is to do the fire testing for this gypsum board for your one client in the United States. So you had a hard time sourcing this really basic thing, gypsum board, to put in these panels. So anyway, that's codes and standards. Sorry, excuse me. That's standards and a lack of harmonization. You find it everywhere, not just elevators. The second thing is over dimensioning. America is a place with a lot of land and a lot of wealth. And it's often really easy to solve problems by just making something bigger, thicker, bigger, stronger, whatever. In elevators, there's things you want to fit in the elevator. You want an elevator, but also you want it to be big enough. And two of the major things that someone might want in an elevator are accessibility, especially wheelchairs, which tend to be the largest sort of mobility devices, or actually scooters are even larger, to fit in an elevator. And then the second one is stretchers. And most of the world, well, all of the world pretty much all of the world outside of the United States and Canada have decided that, for the accessibility part, the way to thread this needle is to have every elevator be large enough for a wheelchair and one person standing behind it. So, the wheelchair can wheel in and, person on the wheelchair, obviously, and then one person can stand behind them. If the person can't move on their own or needs help or whatever, you can have someone stand behind them. The United States decided it's a little unclear to me when it was decided, I think in the 1980s, that there should be room for a wheelchair to turn so that you can enter the elevator face forward and then leave the elevator face forward. When the decision was made, I'm not sure that there was a lot of thought that went into it. In the 80s, this was sort of like the age of Ralph Nader. There's a great book about it called Public Citizens. It's, these sort of lawyers getting involved in government, and they essentially encoded this into law in what you mentioned, the FHA, the Fair Housing Act, specifically the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which then applied disability regulation to the Fair Housing Act. And it requires that I shouldn't say every elevator, but certainly every new elevator, most new elevators have to accommodate a wheelchair that can turn all the way around. And then the second dimensioning thing that we do that other people do not is we require that the elevator accommodate a fully extended stretcher. So a 7-foot long stretcher. In other countries, they'll often require that it accommodate a stretcher, but only above a certain height. Whereas in the United States, it's also above a certain height, but it's a lower height, essentially. So what this means is that our elevators are twice as large as elevators. Most elevators installed in the United States are twice as large as most elevators installed in Europe. And to have a turning radius for a wheelchair is a good thing. To fit a stretcher is a good thing. But they're not free good things. They cost money. And this money means, first of all, the elevator will be a bit more expensive, but it also means you might not get the elevator at all. So I live in a 5-story walk-up building. It has no elevator. One of the weird quirks of United States accessibility law is that federal accessibility law does not require an elevator at any height whatsoever. You can technically build a 20-story building without an elevator if you want. It's up to the developer to decide. But if you do include an elevator, then you trigger this cascade of accessibility requirements, both in the elevator and, as you've discovered, in the bathrooms as well. And it has a perverse incentive, which is that it disincentivizes you from installing elevators. And as a result, the United States has fewer elevators per capita than any first world country I could find, and even more than countries that are, just as suburban as we do. So something you notice in codes and standards is there's not a good analysis of costs and benefits, and costs in dollar terms, but also in the thing you're actually looking for. So when new fire safety regulations come in, they don't consider, are we making it harder to build a new building at all? And new buildings are always more fire safe than old buildings. New buildings are always more accessible than old buildings. So it creates there's a ratchet effect, and the way that codes and standards are written, which we can get into in a moment, is not as rigorous as I would like to see it with the evaluation of these costs and benefits. And I think as a result, we often overshoot and make things not just unaffordable, but the actual thing that we're trying to encourage, we discourage it, in various ways. So it's overdimensioning. So the third thing I'm going to mention, I'm not going to talk at length about it, but it's the labor situation. The United States, every country relies a lot on immigrants for construction. The United States has let's say, a bifurcation of the immigrant construction labor force, of the construction labor force, where single family houses, in the places that build a lot of single family, so Texas, for example, if you're building in Texas, if you're doing plumbing, you do not need a permit to install plumbing in a single family home. As a result, single family houses in Texas have a lot of plumbing done by, frankly, undocumented immigrants. Whereas if you're building a multifamily building in Texas, you do need a what's called a license. Technically, you don't need to be a citizen to get the license, but in practice, you need to be a citizen to get the license. So in single family houses, in these sprawling areas where you're building, 500 tract homes on quarter acre lots, there's going to be the workforce is going to be dominated by undocumented immigrants. You can pay them less. There's a lot more of them. In cities, when you're building denser housing, you're going to be limited to a more documented workforce. You're going to have less labor available. In Europe, they've opened the borders to Eastern Europe. So, all 27 European Union countries, plus a couple sort of get thrown in various ways, sort of have an open borders regime within them. And as a result, it's a lot easier to hire construction labor. So in the elevator industry, you see this intensely. It's extremely well paid, but even more importantly than that, for the costs, there have been negotiated a bunch of union contracts whereby pre-assembly and prefabrication of parts is not allowed. So holes have to be drilled on site, not in the factory. In some cases, you actually need to drill the hole in the factory for alignment purposes. So they just drill the hole twice. The contract states we're just going to drill the hole twice. You drill a small hole in the factory and then the larger hole on site. And you see this, you see this in the plumbing thing that I mentioned. Codes, plumbing codes in the United States have all sorts of whatever the opposite of labor saving is, sort of things in them that require a lot more work. So anyway, these are the three things you see in elevators, but you see them everywhere, which is a lack of harmonization of codes and standards, over-dimensioning, and then just very, very thorny labor problems, often tied up around immigration.
If you want to show your support for this podcast and also have the chance to win a really cool hat like what I'm wearing, if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, you can leave a 5-star review, screenshot it, and send it to playbook@buildingculture.com. When we hit 100 reviews on Spotify and Apple, respectively, I'll do a raffle, select 10 people, and send out hats. You've got a 10% chance of winning. It's pretty good. Leave a 5-star review, take a screenshot, and send to playbook@buildingculture.com. Would really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Very helpful little summary there. And I want to give one example of how it really, on the dimensioning in particular, not only are the elevators substantially more expensive, like you said, $100 to $150,000 here versus, say 30,000. So there's already this huge delta there, but also they literally take up more space in a building. And people are like, hey, that's no big deal if you're thinking about it in the context of a big multifamily building. Now, here's where I really have a problem with this is I don't have a problem with multifamily buildings or big buildings, but I and many people would like to build more human scaled, kind of like gentle density buildings where they're 2 and 3 story, buildings. Maybe it's a two, a 3 story, 4,000 square foot building. So each floor plate is about 1,300 square feet. If you have to put an American, and imagine a whole street of these, if you're a developer and you're trying to put a bunch of small office buildings that individuals, businesses could literally buy and own. Well, you actually have to put, because it's commercial and you've got office upstairs, you actually have to put an elevator in each one of those. So imagine each one of these buildings costs about $1 million to build, and you're having to put $120,000 elevator in each one while eating up a bunch of square footage. It makes it untenable. It doesn't work. It's over 10% of the budget just to put the elevator in, and you can't build the building without putting an elevator in. So you're just kind of stuck. So it's like, well, that's why there's just big office buildings and things like that. And I think that's really unfortunate because we should be serving um, disabilities and stuff. And I think you mentioned something for yourself, but I mean, I am too. I can't really walk very well. I can get upstairs actually fairly well. Although if I had to walk up 5 flights every day, I just wouldn't be able to do that because I've got a bad foot from an injury. So it's not like I'm not sympathetic to it. It's more that I think there's other ways to thread the needle, as you kind of hinted about how it happens in Europe. It's like, hey, as long as we have offices downstairs, do we have to have a $150,000 commercial elevator to a second floor? And I know there's some rules around if it's under a 3,000 square foot footprint, maybe, but then if it has retail on the bottom and then it's a shopping center and there's four or more of those, then everything has to be an elevator. So it's just once again so convoluted and it makes things extremely expensive where you just can't do small scale urban density, or makes it very, very difficult and expensive.
Yeah, the rules really bite for small buildings. Except for the office part, you've actually described my building very well, which is it was a 3 story. It was 2 apartments over a store, and the developer added 2 stories to it. So it's now 5 stories. Each one is about 1,200 square feet, 2 units per floor. And New York City actually does have a rule requiring an elevator if the building is 5 stories. The rest of the country does not. They just leave it up to the developer. But since it was an older building and they used an older building code, they expanded the building under an older building code, they weren't required to install an elevator, and they didn't. So it's a 5 story walk-up building, fairly luxurious. You can see my ceilings are almost 10 feet tall. The sales price was, I don't know, $1,200 a foot, like really expensive. It doesn't have an elevator. It's a 5 story walk-up. And
Did you do
you
that
know,
new?
2015.
I didn't think you could do that new. I thought if it was commercial, even office upstairs.
Well, it's no longer it's now there's retail on the ground. Oh, yeah. Well, good question,
Yeah,
actually. I don't know. I don't
right.
know how they made it work with the Fair Housing Act. Um, but anyway, with some modifications, it's definitely legal. If the ground floor had an apartment on it, that would be legal in every city in the country. And you're starting to see more and more of them in Seattle, especially really tall walk-up buildings. No, the law the federal accessibility law says that as long as the ground floor has an accessible apartment, then the upper floors do not need to be accessible. And
If it's residential, yeah.
if it's residential, yes. Yeah, office is commercial is a different story. The Americans with Disabilities Act governs there. And yeah, that's more stricter. But anyway, the point is that there's always ways around. If something gets too expensive, there's ways around it. You just don't build it. You build townhouses instead of a small condo building. You build a walk-up building, or like I said, you just don't build the thing at all. Increase, in the United States, there's a lot of urban buildings that we just don't build. We build a lot of sprawl, and that's it. And I think our codes do not do our codes and standards and federal regulations do not do a very good job of weighing the costs and the benefits and considering it. And sometimes it's really hard to weigh these things. And frankly, I don't think that every single rule needs to go through a rigorous cost benefit analysis. It would cost a lot of money actually. But the way that I approach these things is I would like to see what is done in other places. Like if everywhere in the world is doing things one way, I don't need to study it. I'm just going to do it. I think we should just do it that way. And that's how it is for elevators. Like I don't, does the tow guard need to be this long or that long? Can the machine room have this much clearance or that much clearance? I don't know. But, if the whole world outside of the United States, Canada, has decided to do it one way, I'm happy with that way. And I think that is the approach that we should probably be taking for a lot of denser buildings in particular. So anyway,
I really think building codes need to be justified. Like once they happen, they still need to be reviewed. I don't know, 5 years later, say, is it doing the thing we want it to do? And is it causing any externalities that we were not expecting? And it actually has to be renewed to keep going. And I'll give you like a small example because we've been talking about elevators. There's this new electrical requirements where you have to have this what's called an arc fault breaker on a lot of things. And the interesting thing about arc fault breakers is they're, I don't know, 10 times more expensive than a normal breaker, which granted, that's not a huge expense, but that's just one tiny example. And this was in the most recent building code. We're having to put arc fault breakers in on behind fridges. Well, guess what? The fridges actually trip the breaker because when anything with like a motor, the machine turns on and often trips it. So what's happening is I've never met an electrician that likes it. They hate them. So what do people do? They have to put the arc fault in to pass code. And then what happens? They take it out. And I found out about it because I had some homeowners call me. They got back from vacation and they just bought this very nice house from us and their fridge was spoiled because it was off. And this is how I found out about it when the electrician's like, well, we're having to install these arc fault breakers now. And then I can't even take it out because I don't want to expose myself to liability. So it's like I can tell the homeowner what's going on. And it's just an absurd um, it's just an absurdity. And like, what is it even protecting against? And that's kind of this thing about there is no such thing as like infinite safety or like perfect safety. And so many rules come out of some random thing that happened once. And then you make a bunch of rules about it. And we were just looking at some fire code stuff and I can't remember the details. But one of the architects on our team, Matt, was looking into this and he found out, well, because he was doing an AIA thing, is like, this code actually came from 100 something years ago because there was a Christmas tree in a building that had candles with fire on them. And then the whole tree was sprayed in, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting some kind of petroleum product. And then, it caught fire and then the building burned down. And then they make a bunch of building codes around it that are frankly kind of stupid. And you're going, that was not the problem with the building. If the problem is you have a Christmas tree with, fire prone paint on it with candles. And so I just find stuff like that so frustrating. And that the bureaucracy, I'm really starting to refer to it as tyrannical bureaucracy because it has gotten insidious and to the point where it serves itself and is actively opposed to good building, affordable building, the kind of places that people want to see. I'm not saying all codes are bad. I'm just saying it is well past the line now for me in certain areas.
yeah, yeah. There's when there's a major fire, there's a very interesting paper called this by some fire engineers. I think I don't know, Australian or New Zealand. Anyway, it's called Golden Rules and Magic Numbers or Magic Rules and Golden Numbers. And it's, what they say is, after a major event, especially a mass casualty fire, which most fires are not mass casualty fires. They're, it's frankly like one or two elderly people dies at a time. But the mass casualty fires are the ones that grab people's attention. And so what happens after it, you enumerate all of the things that went wrong, any of which, if you had fixed them, would have fixed the problem. And it's a long list. It's always a long list. During COVID, people might remember that Swiss cheese analogy where, nothing is going to be foolproof, but if you layer a bunch of things on top of each other, eventually you'll get a good enough result. And so, you pick all of the things that could have been different that would have, prevented the fire, and then you change them all. And that's overkill. And it leads to overkill, and it can lead to, not achieving your end goal of reducing fire deaths. So one of the best recent examples of that is, Grenfell in London. There was that high-rise fire, and it killed, I don't remember how many people, dozens of people. And it really upended, the construction industry and fire protection industry in the UK. And, the primary problem with that building was that the facade was flammable. It wasn't supposed to be flammable, and it was. And so a small fire that started, it was a malfunctioning refrigerator, actually, sparked, it created a spark. It lit something, I think it set on fire in an apartment that led a window, a vinyl window frame to set on fire. And then that put, the whole facade on fire. And then eventually you have this, the whole outer face of this building is on fire. And so they went through and they found, everything that could have been different, everything that you could have changed to fix it, and they changed them all. And so now you essentially cannot build out of mass timber above, I don't know, something like 6 stories, I think, in the UK anymore. And the building didn't have any timber in it at all. They now require a second stair for all buildings above roughly 6 stories. They require sprinklers in, all buildings above something like 4 stories. Anyway, to an American, that all sounds like, well, we don't allow any of these things either. But there's a British fire engineer who pointed out, you've really gone too far here, and you've politicized the whole thing. Instead of a bunch of fire engineers doing sort of a careful analysis of it, you just have these politicians who sort of have run wild with the thing. And another point, I think there's often in the fire engineering world, in the code world, there's this sort of taboo against thinking about costs and benefits and, weighing these things. And the problem is that it's counterproductive, because even in the richest, society on earth, which is, I don't know, the United States or Norway or Luxembourg, whatever, the money is not infinite. There are an infinite number of things you could do to a building to make it safe. We have a sprinkler system, but if the sprinkler system goes off, then you have to turn it off. And then 2 days later, what if there's another fire? So why don't we have a second sprinkler system? In elevators, you press a button and, it alerts that someone's trapped in the thing, but then there's also communication that goes on, so that they can tell you we're on our way, or you're having a heart attack or whatever. And recently in the United States and pretty much nowhere else, they've decided, well, now we need a two-way visual communication device, because what if someone is hard of hearing? Okay, but what if the person doesn't speak English? Why isn't there a requirement that it be simultaneous interpretation in Spanish? And my grandma doesn't speak Spanish; she speaks Romanian. Why not Romanian too? There's an infinite number of these things you can do, and in order to pick between them, you need to know what the costs and benefits of each one of them are, so that you can pick the most effective things. Because if you don't, you're just reacting to whatever, some person who happened to make their way to the hearing had the idea to do. And you're leaving on the table things that frankly might be better. So I'll just give an example. I saw some fire engineers, there's currently fires raging within the city of LA. And, someone posted on LinkedIn essentially that there should be greater separation between buildings. And, someone said, well, what about ADUs? They're allowing all these accessory dwelling units in the back. Specifically, it was about sheds. You have a wood shed in the backyard, and, it can set on fire, and it can contribute, embers, which then can set the main house on fire. And, they're like, well, we should have greater separation of buildings, was the conclusion. Maybe we should rethink ADUs. Okay, well, you could also build the buildings out of brick and stone. But if you spent all your money forcing people to buy lots that are twice the size and put their shed, 50 feet away instead of 20 feet away, and, they can't build an ADU, then you don't have money to require bricks and concrete. And, maybe bricks and concrete aren't the solution. Maybe it's sprinklers. Maybe it's, clearing areas outside of, I don't know what it is. But the point is, there's an infinite number of things you can do to prevent these fires from happening in the first place, or mitigate them if they do. And we don't have an infinite amount of money, so we have to choose between them. So if you're not considering the cost, then you're not even going to pick the most effective solution, never mind, one that, people are happy to pay for. So anyway, that is just, there are many, many issues I see with the codes. And like I said, the codes have become so complicated that it's not really realistic to do a in-depth analysis for every single item. But at the very least, we should aspire to it, and, at least think about these things a little more, and, at the very least, write down the cost and, try to get the benefit, which we don't do today. Like a lot of these code changes, at the body that writes them, which we can talk about in a minute, you're supposed to write the cost of the change, but most people don't. Most people sort of fudge it and say, it's an editorial change, it's not going to affect cost. And, often that's not true. There's a great paper by Emily Hamilton for the Cato Institute about how these cost benefit analyses, excuse me, how the cost impact, because they don't even claim to do a benefit analysis, how the cost impact is determined. And it's pretty subpar. And I've seen it. I've seen a lot of code changes where, someone, for example, only takes into account the price of the part and not the labor, even though the labor is like most of it. So we don't really think that much about and cost, and it's kind of taboo in the industry to think that much about cost. Yeah.
I'm going to share a little trick we use at Building Culture. So, if you're designing a house, you have to have egress windows or egress in any bedroom, for example. And the problem with that is egress windows are very large, especially if it's a double hung window or something like that. And because of design constraints, sometimes we want a smaller window if it's in a dormer or just for the hierarchy of the elevations. Well, a really cool trick that we use with our Sierra Pacific windows is we'll take something from their urban casement line and we'll put what's called a piano hinge on it. And so rather than kind of a normal casement that kind of slides open where only part of the window is open, this is almost like a door hinge. And so the entire window opens and you can meet egress with a 2 foot by 4 foot window, a 2040 window. It's the smallest possible egress window anyone makes. And that's a nice little design trick. If you're as nerdy as I am, you will actually think that's really cool. So check out Sierra Pacific Windows. And if you are in the state of Oklahoma, check out One Source Windows and Doors. We at Building Culture use both of them regularly.
Yeah, no, I want to jump in next into kind of the ICC and how codes are made because that was part of what was so interesting to me that I hadn't understood before. I do want to say one more thing about, in addition to evaluating the cost with these things, is really not making codes in isolation, as in we've become, because buildings are so complicated these days, we've got all an entire industry of all these different specialists, and then those specialists all advocate for their little area of expertise to change codes, and then no one can really argue with them because they're saying this is going to make the fire whatever, it's going to make it safer in terms of fire, and everyone's like, okay, well, we want safer buildings. And so there's not real consideration. I'll give an example of, like, I was recently in a meeting with a local fire department. I won't say which one, but somewhere in Oklahoma. And they were talking about how they ordered new fire trucks for the city. I said, hey, has there ever been any conversation about ordering smaller fire trucks, especially for these downtown areas where, people are complaining that it's tough to, maneuver and stuff. And he wasn't rude. Very, very nice gentleman. I think he wanted the best, right? It's not like I looked at this person like, man, this guy's a jerk. Very nice person, but he just looked so confused. And he said, why, well, we need this fire truck so we can, and I don't understand it. He rattled off a bunch of technical stuff that then I can't respond to because I'm like, I don't even know what you just said about gallons per minute. And I just said, well, the rest of the world, we have the biggest fire trucks in the entire world. Everywhere else has smaller fire trucks and they seem to manage pretty well. So why couldn't we? But that was just, he's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, we need these fire trucks for blah, 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 blah. And once again, I'm not an expert, so can't argue. And it made me just really think, it stuck with me because I'm like, man, we can't just have specialists advocating for their little piece of the pie. Because that doesn't lead to good outcomes. We really need kind of a more holistic approach of, like, I know the ICC has different people at the table, but I don't know. That doesn't seem to work very well. But where there's actual people talking about, okay, how does this work in real life? How much is it going to cost? What other externalities are there going to be? Does this make sense as a whole? And with that, let's jump into the ICC, the International Code Council, which, as you pointed out, is anything but international.
Yeah, yeah. So, the overarching question is, how are building codes and standards written? And at the end of the day, these become laws. So, the thing that says you need a sprinkler, or, the elevator has to be this size, it's written into the municipal code or the state codes. But the way that they are really written is not by government. Because the codes have become so complicated, the codes and standards. If you added them up, like all of the codes and standards, I sometimes I ask people in the field this, and they like, oh, I don't even know. I mean, the code itself is, the quote unquote building code itself is, I don't know, I think more than 1,000 pages, but then it references all of these standards, like I said, for the smoke detector and the self-closing door and the elevator and whatever. And if you added up all of the numbers of these pages, you'd end up at least in the hundreds of thousands and possibly more. So, in Texas, for example, every municipality writes its own every municipality adopts its own building code. Obviously, they don't write their own building code. Obviously, a town of 3,000 people is not writing hundreds of thousands of pages. What they do is they adopt what are called model codes and standards, which are, someone else has written them and said, this is not the law, but I suggest it be the law. And the states and localities say, oh, okay, this is the law. We're just going to copy and paste this. We're going to, either we're going to copy and paste it, or, in the legislation, we'll just say, just look at the model code. That's your law. And the bodies that there used to be multiple bodies that wrote different building codes. And remember, the building code is the sort of top one, the master code we can think about is, and then it references all these codes and standards. But let's just talk about the building code, for example. It's written by, there was consolidation in the United States. I've actually heard that it was sort of in reaction to things that were happening abroad, where they were consolidating codes internationally, and so there was these three bodies that wrote regional model codes. There was one for the Northeast, there was one for the Southeast, and there was one for the West Coast. And then I don't know, they kind of came together in Missouri or something like that. And so they merge and they create one model code. And the idea is, and they were successful, is that, every jurisdiction in the United States, maybe they modify it a little, but this is the basis of their code. And so this organization is called the International Code Council. I think they had aspirations and still do have aspirations of being an international organization, whose codes are adopted not just in the United States, but also abroad. In practice, it's not really adopted abroad. The World Series, I think there's one Canadian team that plays in it. There's no Canadian jurisdiction that plays in the International Building Code, or at least that adopts it. There may be a couple jurisdictions in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, due to the American military presence, that have adopted, or at least allow as an option, some of the ICC codes. But in general, it is the United States Building Code. It's called the International Building Code. It's not international. There's, on the committees, I've never seen somebody from another country participate. Maybe from another country, but, living in the United States. But there's nobody, living outside the United States who I've seen who participates at a high level in the writing of the codes. And it's a non-governmental organization. I think technically it's organized as a 501c6, which is it's called a business league. And they have a process for writing the codes. But since it's not a governmental organization, it's not subject to the same rules that a government would be. So, for example, they don't perform the same cost-benefit analyses that governments have to perform. They don't, when you contribute to it, the sort of main event, which is it's essentially 1 or 2 times a year. You go and you make your proposals and you can debate them. It has to be done in person, which is quite expensive. So, it costs a lot of money to participate because you got to fly somewhere twice a year and stay in a hotel. And, it's pretty much have to stay there for a week because they don't give you a great time about when your item will be heard. And, at the end of the process, people vote on it, and the people who vote are only what are called the government members, which are mostly code officials, and I think partly some firefighters. But it's not a governmental organization. It's, fundamentally a non-governmental organization. And so governments have sort of outsourced it to this organization. And it's not an organization that anyone outside of the code and fire worlds and the materials manufacturers participates in. So, for example, mayors who might be concerned about housing affordability, or planning departments who, have to live with their rules and have to say things like, there's no sense in us upzoning a 25-foot wide lot because it doesn't really work. They don't have any say in it. They don't participate in it. The employees of the mayors, in the building departments and in the fire departments have votes that they can use, but they're not, like, the mayors aren't looking at how they're voting. So it's a rule writing by bureaucrats, but outside of the bureaucracy, if that makes sense, is how I would put it. And as a result, it's a sort of very insular world. it's not a world that is well in tuned with especially urban affordability challenges. I often find myself like explaining to people what YIMBY, yes in my backyard, stands for, because they just haven't heard it. The process is also heavily tilted towards smaller jurisdictions. So at the end of the process, there's a large vote that happens, and you get X amount of votes if you're from a municipality. If well, each each jurisdiction, if the jurisdiction has less than 50,000 residents, they get X number of votes. If they have between 50 and 150 thousand residents, they get 2X votes, twice. And then if they have more than 150,000 residents, they get 3X votes. And what this means is that, New York City, a city of nearly 9 million people, and then, I don't know, whatever large suburb of 150,000 people get the same number of votes. And then, three very tiny jurisdictions get the same number of votes as New York City or Oklahoma City or wherever. And as a result, the larger cities often do not participate as much in the process. Like New York City and Chicago are almost totally absent. They don't really speak up very much. And whether that, I don't know what the cause is or what the effect is, but it's a code that does not work well, in my opinion, for cities, and for cities especially that want to encourage a lot of infill development. And I think this stems from the way that the whole process is organized. In other countries, the building code is written by governments, like not just government officials, but actual governments themselves. And, there's often, people can speak kind of negatively about, politicians involving themselves in these things. But the whole sort of conceit of democratic government is that, the people vote for people, and then those people carry out the will of the people. And when it's a sort of world and industry that tries to keep politicians out of it as much as possible. And I think this divorces it a bit from some of the most pressing concerns in society, to be honest, especially affordability, you know, environmentalism, density, these sort of things. So anyway, that's the structure of who writes the codes and how I think it the structure of all organizations, I think, ultimately determines the content of the rules that they write. And I think that the structure is fairly, geared towards smaller jurisdictions and, heavily geared towards building officials and fire officials with, little to no involvement from anybody else. And as a result, I think it's a code that I think building officials and fire officials like a lot. And increasingly, I think other people, find things lacking with it.
Yeah, it's really, I think when we first talked to you, I can't remember exactly how you said it. You said when I really started looking into it, I'm not saying I thought it was just what it was like completely terribly corrupt, but a good bit corrupted. I can't remember how you said it, and it was something about kind of this idea of once again, not necessarily bad actors, although there might be some of those, but also this open kind of door between the people creating the regulations and industry, and even talking about how a lot of previous firemen and fire marshals and stuff end up in the fire industry creating sprinkler systems and stuff. And so, is there really a lot of incentive in the US to say, hey, maybe for masonry buildings, we could have different fire sprinkler codes than for wood frame buildings that are highly flammable? No, there's actually no distinction made whatsoever, from my understanding. Could you talk a little bit more about, and it reminds me of even what's kind of going on in the US right now with, we've got all our healthcare and FDA, and we're like, hold on, our regulators, people saying what's healthy, blah, 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 end up making millions and millions of dollars over here on the private side. This doesn't seem right. And a lot of people are getting mad about it. And I think it's for very, very good reason. The FDA seems completely untrustworthy to me at this point because of the revolving door with pharmaceutical and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that in relation to the ICC and what you've seen?
Yeah, there's a lot of interests and industries, and sometimes the line between government and private industry is not that clear. There's the fire protection industry, and I would say that the firefighters often sort of fall within that because, um, In a lot of places, the firefighters are, for example, inspecting the sprinkler systems, doing the plan reviews for the sprinkler systems, and therefore they have sort of similar interest to the sprinkler industry. And then often, firefighters can retire fairly early, so it's pretty common for them to actually go into the sprinkler industry and become contractors or consultants or something like that. And then you have, the process costs a lot of money to participate in. First of all, you have to show up in person, but it's very complicated. And it kind of needs to be your full time job in order to make an impact there. And the materials manufacturers, it's quite common if you look at the hearings that you know some of the most common the most vocal commenters are the concrete the ready mix concrete industry, the timber industry, the steel industry. There's like interests that you would not realize exist, who speak here. And in any regulatory environment, the manufacturers or people who are in the industry or in government that have this sort of their own interests are going to speak up. But if you don't have the politicians who are the representatives of the people, in the mix, then sort of all you have is the particular interest. I'm not going to call them special interests, but these particular interests with particular perspectives, and there aren't people who are taking. There aren't as many people who are taking like a big picture approach. And then another way I should say the ICC is organized is that there's various committees that deal with various things, and the National Association of Home Builders has negotiated a certain amount of seats on different committees, and they have more seats on what are called the residential committees, which are the ones that govern single family codes. Yeah, the IRC, then the multifamily code, which is the International International Building Code, which regulates multifamily buildings. And so the International Residential Code is way easier to work with. In a lot of countries, they would actually look at our single family houses and say, wow, this isn't safe. You built the thing out of, light wood frame. This is not allowed elsewhere. But then on the other hand, they look at our multifamily buildings and are like, whoa, this is really overkill. You have things in your 6-story buildings that we don't even have in our skyscrapers.
So what you're saying is the NAHB, the National Association of Home Builders, is literally an association of people building homes. And so people building homes have a
It's
say
actually,
on the IRC. So that code
yeah,
looks a lot different than the
we have more of
IBC,
a say.
which
Yeah.
doesn't have that kind of like actual, you could say, builders with the same kind of level of voice and power
Yes.
on the
Yes. Yeah.
IBC.
Yeah. There's some on them, but few. Well, there's one. They get one vote on the IBC committee and 4 votes on the IRC committees. And also,
Wow.
National Association of Home Builders mostly does single family houses. So even though they're on the IBC, it's not of as much interest to their members as the multifamily stuff. And surprisingly, the multifamily developers do not have the presence that I would have expected there. It often feels like the IRC is sort of, the International Residential Code, which governs single family, is sort of watched like a hawk for cost issues by the NAHB. And then the multifamily, the IBC, which governs multifamily and commercial construction, sometimes it feels like no one's watching the hen house. And so, specific interests, whether it's, private sector fire protection industry or, firefighters or whatever, their perspective tends to win out on the IBC, in the IBC more so than in the IRC. And as a result, there's anyone involved in the real estate industry in the United States knows that a single family house is per square foot the cheapest thing to build, at least for the same level of quality. You can have some really luxurious single family homes, but for a given level of quality, it's always going to be cheaper to build a single family house detached than a townhouse. It's always going to be cheaper to build a townhouse than a low rise apartment complex, and it's always going to be cheaper to build a low rise apartment complex than a mid rise apartment complex. And I always knew this, and I always thought, well, that makes sense. What I did not realize is this is not true in other countries. In other countries, the cost is the same. When you go from single family detached to to mid-rise multifamily, the cost per square foot or per square meter is going to be the same. And, I know part of that is that their multifamily buildings are cheaper than ours. I suspect also in the rest of the world, their single family houses are more expensive than ours because, they build them out of concrete and masonry. But once you learn about the incentives within the ICC and other codes and standards, and the way that smaller jurisdictions that have primarily have single family houses are overrepresented and larger ones are underrepresented, and that the home builders have more of a say on the single family committees than the multifamily ones, you start to see why it's emerged this way. And I think this is really the challenge of anyone who wants to build multifamily housing and wants to change these codes to make it easier to build denser forms of housing in denser places, is not only the content of the code but also these institutional incentives that go to write it. So that is, I guess that's my problem, or my fight. It's everyone's problem, but I guess is my fight.
Yeah, and I want to talk here next about just there's a lot more to unpack here, but I want to kind of jump to what people can do about it. But first, I also want to make a comment on, it's interesting. It hadn't struck me the last time you said it, but talking about the ICC being, a nonprofit, an NGO, so to say, a non-government entity, and that's come up recently, just in kind of U.S. politics stuff. And I don't really mean this politically, just but that the government outsourcing regulation to quote unquote NGOs, non-government entities, and then making them actual enforceable regulation is really not an NGO. Like, it completely defeats the purpose of an NGO. And the way it's come up in the US is about around free speech stuff. Basically, hey, the government can't actually actively censor speech, so they've given money to NGOs and nonprofits who then go and censor speech and work towards those kinds of things. And really saying that's a pretty kind of sinister dynamic. And I don't think it's necessarily the same here with the ICC to that extent. But it does bother me because, once again, there's really no one to hold accountable. Like, and it's funny because I think I'm increasingly, just over time, running business and having to deal with kind of government and regulation every day of my life with what we do, whether it's financial stuff or building or zoning or city stuff or state stuff or national stuff. I'm more libertarian, becoming more libertarian. So I'm kind of laughing that I'm saying, man, I kind of wonder if the government needs to get more involved with building codes or something like that. But it does really bother me that there's just no one. Who are you going to get mad at? Who can you fire about this? No one. And that's part of what's kind of broken about all of this, I think.
Yeah, you've landed on something very important, I think, which is, if we're going to have building codes, and I think we're going to have building codes.
Right.
Um,
I'm an advocate for building codes, to be clear to everyone listening.
yeah, who's gonna write the building code? And yeah, I mean, if you the government is hard to deal with, but if the government is throwing up its hands and deferring to another group, you've added another layer there. And to your question of what to do about it, if I, my the way that I approach research is that I always just want to know what we do in the United States first, and then I want to know what they do in other places. And eventually I'd like to get to the point where I'm comparing the merits of them. But the basics are just like, understand the lay of the land, understand what the options are. And in the rest of the world, the governments tend to write the building codes. And specifically, they tend to be written by like higher levels of government. So in the United States, it's often very local. In Texas, for example, or Colorado, it's adopted by localities. In other states, in other places, it's typically done at the state level. But states in the United States can be quite small. And so if I look, how would we make our codes more like those in other places? You can probably guess where I come down on this, but I won't say that this is what we should do. But it would be more federal involvement in writing the building code. The feds are involved in writing one building code, which is the what's called the HUD code, stands for Housing and Urban Development, but it's the Manufactured Housing Code, otherwise known as trailer houses, which also happen to be the most affordable kind of housing in the United States. So there was in the 70s, Ronald Reagan really slashed the bureaucracy's budgets, and any kind of desire to get more federal involvement in building codes, not just writing them, but also like doing research about them. There was a lot of research, for example, about efficiencies in plumbing codes just ended. And everything sort of got outsourced to somebody else, because somebody had to write the building code, because there wasn't the appetite to not have building codes. So, it strengthened the hand of these, and these non-governmental nonprofits. Um, and so, to answer the question I think you were about to ask, which is how do you get involved in this? It's really difficult to get involved in it because the government has outsourced it to this nonprofit. The nonprofit, it's difficult and expensive to participate in the process. If you really want to have a literal voice and speak at the hearings, you're probably in for $1,000 or $2,000 twice a year to go fly and show up and sit around for a week until the item you want to comment comes up. Um, but I think it's important that I think reasonable people can disagree about how these things should be written. And I have a perspective, and I'm sure everyone in the code world vehemently disagrees with it. But I think it is important for legislators and for government entities to actually understand how these codes are written. And I don't think most legislators understand how the building codes come about. I think they tend to be surprised when I mention that it's pretty much all outsourced. And that the people they employ are at the end of the day participating in the process, but not in a way that's like accountable. The votes that happen at the ICC, for example, it's government employees taking these participating in these votes, but it's not public who voted or how they voted, even though they are, it's at the U.S. Senate. Every senator's vote is public. That's not the case in building codes. So I think there are more intense ways to get involved. Follow the local adoption process, get involved that way. Certainly get involved at the ICC. But some of the most basic things to do would be to just like write your city council member or state legislator or executive and say, I want you to pay more attention to the building code. I think it has a big impact on affordability, livability, environmentalism, fire safety, accessibility, all of these things. And I don't think that it should be, it's within the purview of the government, and you as a government actor should pay attention to it. So that's I guess the most basic thing is like, we have a system of government that is democratic, and if the people you elect are not getting involved in something, then it doesn't have a ton of the popular will. It doesn't have a big impact in it.
Yeah. I will, say which we talked about last time. We haven't really had time to talk about today, but some positive momentum really has been made around the country with the whole single stair debate. And for anyone listening, just a lot of our buildings in the US, essentially in the IBC and multifamily buildings, require two staircases. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it completely changes the shape of a building and how a building can function. And all over the world, and all over Europe, you can have single stair apartment buildings, which really increase affordability, typology, all sorts of positive things. And because, like you're saying, things are adopted either at the state or local level, and I'll use Oklahoma as an example. It's adopted at the state level, and then at the local level, they have to, at minimum, do that. But the local level can also be more strict, and unfortunately, a lot of the local level is still more strict. But there really are people that are kind of making some headway around some of these things, like the single stair. Elevators is a harder one. I'll kind of touch on one of the reasons I do think I actually do think I probably agree with you. And it's not something I've thought about a whole lot, but just that maybe it really would make sense for this stuff to be coming from the federal government, because yes, there's dangers to that. Yes, things can go wrong. Yes, it can be bureaucratic, or it will be bureaucratic. It's, a giant government entity, but at least you can have an organization with a vision, and that's saying, hey, we need to balance health. We need to balance safety. We need to balance cost. We need to balance beauty. And here's the kinds of cities and the kinds of housing that we want. So let's then back into the rules about how to make that, and at least there's the potential of that. When someone new takes over HUD or someone new takes over the FDA, you can get swings in either way depending on who's kind of in charge of that. But in some ways, at least someone can implement a coherent vision, versus when it's kind of outsourced through the ICC like this. It just seems like a nightmare to me, and it's only going to get worse. That's really not, I'm not really commenting on what to do about it. I'm just commenting on, I hope over time, as housing is going to increasingly be a big deal in this country, where with affordability and things like that kind of at one of the most important issues of our time. There's several really important issues, but housing is definitely one of them. And so I hope people, it's going to take several decades, but I'm hoping over time maybe we really can shift how codes are actually made. But to begin with, I agree that the local level, your state representatives who are electing to adopt these, codes, and then also the localities. And then, of course, most states have some kind of body that evaluates, hey, we're going to adopt 90% of the IRC 2024, but we're going to leave out these few sections, so multiple ways to get involved there. And then, Stephen, like, how can people, this is a pretty big mission for you. I know, you've got this organization, you've got at least a website. How can kind of people support you and your work and what you're doing, contribute?
So the website is centerforbuilding.org. That's spelled out, centerforbuilding.org. There'll be a new website in a couple of weeks, which should have an email list, which I don't currently have, but there will be one. There's a donate page there. But I think the most important thing to do is just, pay attention to building codes in whatever way you have the capacity for. If it's just, following me on social media, you can find that on the website, or, reading about it, sending an email to your politicians, whatever it is. Or if you really want to get involved, especially if you're in the industry and, you want to get involved in the ICC or something, that would be great. But, if all you have is money, I'll take your money too.
Cool. What are you on? What's your X or?
I'm not on X anymore. I've ascended to a higher plane. I'm on Blue Sky, and you can find me at Stephen Jacob Smith. So that's STEPHEN JACOB, last name Smith. You can probably spell that. .com. That's the handle. And yeah, I used to be on Twitter or X at Market Urbanism, but I found the user experience has been a bit degraded. So I'm not on there anymore. But you can also email me at Stephen, STEPHEN at centerforbuilding.org. And then the website's the best place.
Cool. Well, Stephen, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge. I'm really glad for all the research you've done. You're one of the people that understands how this stuff works more than anyone I've ever talked to. So I'm really thankful for the work you're doing.
I hope one day you can get an elevator in one of your townhouses, or better yet, build a small condo building with an elevator.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Stephen. I'll talk to you again, maybe have you on another year or two and catch you up on some updates.
Certainly. Thanks so much, Austin. Good luck out there.
All right, bye.
If you've been enjoying this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a 5-star review and take a screenshot, send it to playbook@buildingculture.com. And when we reach 100 reviews, I'm going to send out 10 building culture hats, like up there behind my head if you're watching video, and I'll send it to your house. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you on the next episode.